George Washington, elected the first president in 1789, set up a cabinet form of government, with departments of state, treasury, and war, along with an attorney general. Based in New York, the new government acted quickly to rebuild the nation's financial structure, enacting the program of Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton. The government assumed the Revolutionary War debts of the states and the national government, and refinanced them with new federal bonds. It paid for the program through new tariffs and taxes. The tax on whiskey led to a revolt in the West. Washington raised an army and suppressed it. The nation adopted a Bill of Rights as 10 amendments to the new Constitution. The Judiciary Act of 1789 established the entire federal judiciary, including the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court became important under the leadership of Chief Justice John Marshall, Federalist and Nationalist, who built a strong Supreme Court and strengthened the national government. The 1790s were highly contentious, as the first-party system emerged in the contest between Alexander Hamilton and his Federalist Party, and Thomas Jefferson and his Republican Party. Washington and Hamilton were building a strong national government, with a broad financial base, and the support of merchants and financiers throughout the country. Jeffersonians opposed the new national bank, the Navy, and federal taxes. The Federalists favored Britain, which was embattled in a series of wars with France. Jefferson's victory in 1800 opened the era of Jeffersonian democracy, and doomed the upper-crust Federalists to increasingly marginal roles. The Louisiana Purchase from Napoleon, in 1803, opened vast western expanses of fertile land that exactly met the needs of the rapidly expanding population of yeoman farmers whom Jefferson championed. The Americans declared war on Britain to uphold American honor at sea, and to end the Indian raids in the West. Despite incompetent government management, and a series of defeats early on, Americans found new generals like Andrew Jackson, William Henry Harrison, and Winfield Scott, who repulsed British invasions and broke the alliance between the British and the Indians that held up settlement of the Old Northwest. The Federalists, who had opposed the war to the point of trading with the enemy and threatening secession, were devastated by the triumphant ending of the war. The remaining Indians east of the Mississippi were kept on reservations or moved via the Trail of Tears to reservations in what later became Oklahoma. The spread of democracy opened the ballot box to nearly all white men, allowing the Jacksonian democracy to dominate politics during the second-party system. Whigs, representing wealthier planters, merchants, financiers and professionals, wanted to modernize the society. Using tariffs and federally funded internal improvements, they were blocked by the Jacksonians, who closed down the national bank in the 1830s. The Jacksonians wanted expansion, that is, manifest destiny, into new lands that would be occupied by farmers and planters. Thanks to the annexation of Texas, the defeat of Mexico in war, and a compromise with Britain, the western third of the nation rounded out the continental United States by 1848. Howe argues that the transformation America underwent was not so much political democratization but rather the explosive growth of technologies and networks of infrastructure and communication, the telegraph, railroads, the post office, and an expanding print industry. They made possible the religious revivals of the Second Great Awakening, the expansion of education and social reform. They modernized party politics, as speeded up business by enabling the fast, efficient movement of goods, money and people across an expanding nation. They transformed a loose-knit collection of parochial agricultural communities into a powerful cosmopolitan nation. Economic modernization proceeded rapidly, thanks to highly profitable cotton crops in the South, new textile and machine-making industries in the Northeast, and a fast-developing transportation infrastructure. Breaking loose from European models, the Americans developed their own high culture, notably in literature and in higher education. The Second Great Awakening brought revivals across the country, forming new denominations and greatly increasing church membership, especially among Methodists and Baptists. By the 1840s, increasing numbers of immigrants were arriving from Europe, especially British, Irish, and Germans. Many settled in the cities, which were starting to emerge as a major factor in the economy and society. The Whigs had warned that annexation of Texas would lead to a crisis over slavery, and they were proven right by the turmoil of the 1850s that led to civil war. Federalist era. Washington administration. 1789 to 1797. George Washington, a renowned hero of the American Revolutionary War, commander of the Continental Army, and President of the Constitutional Convention, was unanimously chosen as the first President of the United States under the new U.S. Constitution. All the leaders of the new nation were committed to republicanism, and the doubts of the anti-Federalists of 1788 were allayed with the passage of a Bill of Rights as the first 10 amendments to the Constitution in 1791. The first census, conducted by Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson, enumerated a population of 3.9 million, with a density of 4.5 people per square mile of land area. There were only 12 cities of more than 5,000 population, as the great majority of the people were farmers. Congress passed the Judiciary Act of 1789, which established the entire federal judiciary. At the time, the act provided for a Supreme Court of 6 justices, 3 circuit courts, and 13 district courts. It also created the offices of U.S. Marshal, Deputy Marshal, and District Attorney in each federal judicial district. The Compromise of 1790 located to the national capital in the southern state of Maryland, and enabled the federal assumption of state debts. Washington had hoped that his Secretary of the Treasury would be Robert Morris, celebrated Philadelphia merchant and so-called financier of the Revolution, but he declined, and instead the post went to the president's young former aide-de-camp Alexander Hamilton, who, with Washington's support and Jefferson's opposition, convinced Congress to pass a far-reaching financial program that was patterned after the system developed in England a century earlier. It funded the debts of the American Revolution, set up a national bank, and set up a system of tariffs and taxes. His policies had the effect of linking the economic interests of the states, and of wealthy Americans, to the success of the national government, as well as enhancing the international financial standing of the new nation. Most representatives of the South opposed Hamilton's plan because they had already repudiated their debts and thus gained little from it. But more importantly, there were early signs of the economic and cultural rift between the northern and southern states that was to burst into flames 7 decades later, being that the South in its plantation-based economy resisted the idea of a centralized federal government and being subordinated to northeastern business interests. Despite considerable opposition in Congress from Southerners, Hamilton's plan was moved into effect during the middle of 1790. The first Bank of the United States was thus created that year, despite arguments from Thomas Jefferson and his supporters that it was unconstitutional, while Hamilton declared that it was entirely within the powers granted to the federal government. Hamilton's other proposals, including protection tariffs for nascent American industry, were defeated. The Whiskey Rebellion happened in 1794, when settlers in the Monongahela Valley of western Pennsylvania protested against the new federal tax on whiskey, which the settlers shipped across the mountains to earn money. It was the first serious test of the federal government. Washington ordered federal marshals to serve court orders requiring the tax protesters to appear in federal district court. By August 1794, the protests became dangerously close to outright rebellion, and on August 7, Several thousand armed settlers gathered near Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Washington then invoked the militia law of 1792 to summon the militias of several states. A force of 13,000 men was organized, and Washington personally led it to western Pennsylvania. The revolt immediately collapsed, and there was no violence. Foreign policy unexpectedly took center stage starting in 1793, when revolutionary France became engulfed in war with the rest of Europe, an event that was to lead to 22 years of fighting. France claimed that its 1778 alliance with the U.S. meant that the latter was bound to come to their aid. The Washington administration's policy of neutrality was widely supported, but the Jeffersonians strongly favored France and deeply distrusted the British, who they saw as enemies of republicanism. In addition, they sought to annex Spanish territory in the South and West. Meanwhile, Hamilton and the business community favored Britain, which was by far America's largest trading partner. The Republicans gained support in the winter of 1793–94 as Britain seized American merchant ships and impressed their crews into the Royal Navy. But the tensions were resolved with the Jay Treaty of 1794, which opened up 10 years of prosperous trade in exchange for which Britain would remove troops from its fortifications along the Canadian border. The Jeffersonians viewed the treaty as a surrender to British moneyed interests, and mobilized their supporters nationwide to defeat the treaty. The Federalists likewise rallied supporters in a vicious conflict, which continued until 1795, when Washington publicly intervened in the debate, using his prestige to secure ratification. By this point, the economic and political advantages of the Federalist position had become clear to all concerned. Combined with growing disdain for France after the Reign of Terror and Jacobin anti-religious policies, Jefferson promptly resigned as Secretary of State. Historian George Herring notes the remarkable and fortuitous economic and diplomatic gains produced by the Jay Treaty. Continuing conflict between Hamilton and Jefferson, especially over foreign policy, led to the formation of the Federalist and Republican parties. Although Washington remained aloof and warned against political parties in his farewell address, he generally supported Hamilton and Hamiltonian programs over those of Jefferson. The Democratic-Republican Party dominated the upper southwestern frontier, and in parts of the middle states. Federalist support was concentrated in the major northern cities and South Carolina. After his death in 1799, he became the great symbolic hero of the Federalists. Emergence of political parties. The first party system between 1792 and 1824 featured two national parties competing for control of the presidency, Congress, and the states. The Federalist Party was created by Alexander Hamilton, and was dominant to 1800. The rival Republican Party was created by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, and was dominant after 1800. Both parties originated in national politics, but moved to organize supporters and voters in every state. These comprised probably the first modern party system in the world because they were based on voters, not factions of aristocrats at court or parliament. The Federalists appealed to the business community, the Republicans to the planters and farmers. By 1796, politics in every state was nearly monopolized by the two parties. Jefferson wrote on February 12, 1798, "Two political sects have arisen within the U.S., the one believing that the executive is the branch of our government which the most needs support, the other that, like the analogous branch in the English government, it is already too strong for the republican parts of the Constitution, and therefore in equivocal cases they incline to the legislative powers. The former of these are called Federalists, sometimes aristocrats or monocrats, and sometimes Tories, after the corresponding sect in the English government of exactly the same definition. The latter are styled Republicans, Whigs, Jacobins, anarchists, disorganizers, etc. These terms are in familiar use with most persons. The Federalists promoted the financial system of Treasury Secretary Hamilton, which emphasized federal assumption of state debts, a tariff to pay off those debts, a national bank to facilitate financing, and encouragement of banking and manufacturing. The Republicans, based in the plantation South, opposed a strong executive power, were hostile to a standing army and navy, demanded a limited reading of the constitutional powers of the federal government, and strongly opposed the Hamilton financial program. Perhaps even more important was foreign policy, where the Federalists favored Britain because of its political stability and its close ties to American trade, while the Republicans admired the French and the French Revolution. Jefferson was especially fearful that British aristocratic influences would undermine republicanism. Britain and France were at war 1793 to 1815, with one brief interruption. American policy was neutrality, with the Federalists hostile to France, and the Republicans hostile to Britain. The Jay Treaty of 1794 marked the decisive mobilization of the two parties and their supporters in every state. President Washington, while officially non-partisan, generally supported the Federalists, and that party made Washington their iconic hero. Adams administration 1797 to 1801. Washington retired in 1797, firmly declining to serve for more than 8 years as the nation's head. The Federalists supported Vice President John Adams for president. Adams defeated Jefferson, who as the runner-up became vice president under the operation of the Electoral College of that time. Even before he entered the presidency, Adams had quarreled with Alexander Hamilton, and thus was hindered by a divided Federalist Party. These domestic difficulties were compounded by international complications. France, angered by American approval in 1795 of the Jay Treaty with its great enemy Britain, proclaimed that food and war material bound for British ports were subject to seizure by the French Navy. By 1797, France had seized 300 American ships and had broken off diplomatic relations with the United States. When Adams sent 3 other commissioners to Paris to negotiate, agents of Foreign Minister Charles Maurice de Talleyrand informed the Americans that negotiations could only begin if the United States loaned France $12 million and bribed officials of the French government. American hostility to France rose to an excited pitch, fanned by French Ambassador Edmond Charles Genet. Federalists used the XYZ affair to create a new American army, strengthen the fledgling United States Navy, impose the Alien and Sedition Acts to stop pro-French activities, and enact new taxes to pay for it. The Naturalization Act, which changed the residency requirement for citizenship from 5 to 14 years, was targeted at Irish and French immigrants suspected of supporting the Republican Party. The few convictions won under the Sedition Act only created martyrs to the cause of civil liberties and aroused support for the Republicans. Jefferson and his allies launched a counterattack, with 2 states stating in the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions that state legislatures could nullify acts of Congress. However, all the other states rejected this proposition, and nullification, or it was as it was called, the principle of 98, became the preserve of a faction of the Republicans called the Quids. In 1799, after a series of naval battles with the French, full-scale war seemed inevitable. In this crisis, Adams broke with his party and sent 3 new commissioners to France. Napoleon, who had just come to power, received them cordially, and the danger of conflict subsided with the negotiation of the Convention of 1800, which formally released the United States from its 1778 wartime alliance with France. However, reflecting American weakness, France refused to pay $20 million in compensation for American ships seized by the French Navy. In his final hours in office, Adams appointed John Marshall as Chief Justice. Serving until his death in 1835, Marshall dramatically expanded the powers of the Supreme Court and provided a Federalist interpretation of the Constitution that made for a strong national government.